Good evening, everyone. Welcome. For those of you who are here with us already, those of you who are with us on Zoom, thank you for joining in virtually, all 160 of you, and our friends who are coming in. I just would like to take a moment to welcome you to Rosecliff. I'm Leslie Jones. I'm the Director of Museum Affairs and Chief Curator. This is the Jacalyn and William P. Egan Lecture that we annually host as part of our Research Fellows opportunity. We just want to thank the Egan family for their many generations of support of the Preservation Society, in particular, the dedication that they made to the Fellows program, because it has resulted in wonderful output like we're going to be hearing this evening. I also want to make note and thank two members of our board who are here with us this evening, Kate Enroth, as well as our board chair, Peter Harris. So big round of applause for our board who does a lot of work for us. We will be having a question and answer portion of the evening, which will happen after both of our lectures. So if you can just hold your questions until both of our presenters have presented, that would be great. We will have microphones running around, so just raise your hand, and either Kate or I, in the patterned dresses, will be chasing after you to get your questions. And we would like to also gently remind you to please silence your phones before we begin the presentations. I want to give a special thanks to Dr. Catherine Moran, who is the manager of our Research Fellows program. Catherine has elevated this program really from just a scholarship opportunity to a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity here in Newport to bring in not just individuals who are interested in Newport, but individuals from around the world who have the highest caliber of scholarship. Théo has joined us from France. Isabella, who you'll hear next week, has joined us from the UK. And we are lucky because they want to work with us, and they are the next generation of museum leadership. We offer them an opportunity to not only participate in focused research efforts, but also to see what it's like to work in a very complex organization, because quite frankly, there's nowhere like the Preservation Society of Newport County anywhere else in the world. So it's our joy to give this opportunity to them to meet them, to help with the development of their professionalism, and then watch them go out into the world and really take on the museum, historic preservation, and sciences fields. So we're incredibly grateful for the work that Catherine has done to elevate this program, and also to all the members of the Museum Affairs team who help, again, mentor and lead this work with our fellows. We really wouldn't be able to do much of the work that they are able to focus on our own. So they give a lot back to us. And that relationship will be fostered in the years to come, even after their fellowship opportunities conclude. As I mentioned, we have our fellows this evening, but also the Ido and Peter Kiernan lecture next Tuesday, which will also be here at Rosecliff at 6 p.m., both in person and on Zoom, and that will feature Priscilla Bright and Isabella Hogan. And so before we hear from our presenters, I just want to give them a little bit of an introduction. So Théo Lourenço will be our first presenter. He has earned a diploma of the first cycle of the École du Louvre, magna cum laude, a diploma of museum studies from the École du Louvre, summa cum laude, and a master's degree in museum studies from the École du Louvre, and I'm sure there's a cum laude in there somewhere too. His qualifying dissertations are titled The Louvre, an Encyclopedic Museum, Study of the Pavillon de Sessions, and A Museum in Debate, Study of the Reception of the Decorative Arts Exhibitions at the Louvre. And if you can't tell, Théo is French, so he has joined us from Paris. He actually started his relationship with the Preservation Society 2 years ago as a French Heritage Society intern. That program was begun by our curator emeritus, Paul Miller, in cooperation with the French Heritage Society based in Paris, bringing French scholars to come to Newport and study our vast collections and our connections with France. And with COVID, we sort of flipped that on its head and kept some of our scholars in Paris looking through the repositories there to find information about Newport. And lo and behold, there's a treasure trove of connections in Paris, as we would have expected, but Théo helped us find them. And in that role, he worked on looking for primary resources associated with the Parisian cabinet maker Jules Allard, which we'll also be hearing about tonight in Laura's presentation. Tonight, Théo will speak to you about his role as a curatorial fellow, researching one of Allard's most important American collaborators, the celebrated architect and subject of our current exhibition, Richard Morris Hunt. And I do want to take a moment and sort of having organized that exhibition to give Théo the credit that he deserves, because he really was, in essence, the assistant curator for that show. He did a tremendous amount of work, both before he arrived in the US as an intern and then while he was a fellow here, and created a wonderful narrative with Catherine and myself, and then also found some wonderful new information that we weren't aware of prior. Following Théo, we'll hear from Laura Bergemann, our conservation fellow, and she has received her BS in chemistry from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a MS in conservation of historic and artistic works, and an MA in history of art and archaeology from the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. She was a recipient of the National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship. Laura further excelled in several internship and professional roles, including working as a conservation science fellow at the Museum Conservation Institute for the Smithsonian, the conservation science intern at the Indianapolis Museum of Art at Newfields in Indianapolis, Indiana, an objects conservation intern at the Frick Collection, and a laboratory assistant in the Department of Scientific Research at Sotheby's. So she might be overqualified as a fellow. There are a whole lot of acronyms associated with her skills in spectroscopy, which is not something I'm familiar with, but that it just goes to show that Laura has this application of not only scholarship in art history, but also the sciences that made her uniquely qualified for this program. She also is, she has a comprehensive language studies skills in French, Italian, Latin, Old English, and Middle Egyptian, which unfortunately did not come in handy as a part of this opportunity, so maybe next time. Perhaps in this fall, when she is going to be leaving us as part of her fellowship and entering into a PhD program at Vanderbilt University. So she's really sticking with the Vanderbilt-Newport connection here. She'll be going into interdisciplinary material science, and we hope that Laura continues that work on Jules Allard, and we will have future collaborations together. So it's now my distinct privilege and honor to welcome Théo Lourenço to the podium so we can hear about Richard Morris Hunt in a new light. Théo.
Well, thank you, Leslie. I am very happy to kick off this series of 2 lectures dedicated to the fellowship program of the Preservation Society of Newport County. And I'm especially very excited to be here again at Roskilde, where almost 2 years ago, I gave my first presentation as an intern dedicated to the French cabinet maker and interior designer, Jules Allard, so influential in Newport and including in this very house. But now Roskilde is the home of the new projects I've been working on during my fellowship. Richard Morris Hunt in a New Light, the new exhibition of the Preservation Society, inaugurated on May 30th. We all know Richard Morris Hunt, the architect, especially here in Newport. Whoops, sorry about that. Where more than anywhere else, we can appreciate his contribution to America's architectural history. But what do we know about Hunt, the cultural intermediary, the museum trustee, and as I'd like to say, the son, the brother, the husband, the father, or the friend? Well, this exhibition questions what and who made Hunt, and discusses his influence in the shaping of America's culture. A proud American, born in Brattleboro, Vermont in 1827, but mostly educated in Europe, Hunt had a vision for this country: to bring the best of both worlds, to conceal America's limitless ambition and thirst for grandeur and luxury with Europe's artistic tradition and excellence. But as explained in 1893 by John McVicker Anderson, then president of the Royal Institute of British Architects, this was not an easy task. As Hunt received the gold medal from the Institute, Anderson explained, "The art of a new country is devoid of the native inspiration and guidance to be found in the history of centuries and in ancient monuments, which are the glory of older countries. Who will be so bold as to define or limit the influence exercised by the early masters of the arts in America? Well, it cannot be but that the development of America's architecture has been inspired by one possessing the refined taste, the educated judgment, and the cosmopolitan experience of Richard Maurice Hunt. So now exploring Hunt's educated judgment, cosmopolitan experience, and refined taste, I am very excited to share some of the work I've done in support of this exhibition, as well as some of my personal highlights from the show. Richard Maurice Hunt came from a remarkable family. His father, Jonathan Hunt, was a congressman for the state of Vermont, and in 1843, 11 years after the death of her husband, Hunt's mother, Jane Maria Leavitt, embarked with her 5 children and sailed to Europe to offer her family the best education available. Richard Maurice Hunt, then only 16, first spent a few months in Geneva, Switzerland, where he was introduced to architecture with a local architect, Samuel Darrier. He then decided to move to Paris to enter the École des Beaux-Arts. But in the French capital city, Richard Maurice Hunt, standing on the left in this photograph taken in Paris in the 1850s, was not alone. In the back, his brother, Jonathan, studied medicine, while next to him, William Maurice Hunt, who then became a celebrated painter in America, studied with the French artist Thomas Couture. Jane, the eldest, shared an apartment with her mother in Paris, and together they reportedly often copied at the Louvre. Finally, on the opposite is Leavitt, who actually studied law in Heidelberg, Germany, and became a pioneer in early photography. A section of the show is dedicated to the remarkable Hunt family, for which we actually reviewed an object from our collection. Whose hand? Well, that was surely a hot topic for me. This hand, made of bronze after a plaster cast, is a gift to the Preservation Society from Monsieur Richard Allen Hunt II, a descendant of the Hunt family. An inscription on its base indicates Jane M. Hunt, Paris, 1852. And that's why we used to interpret this object as the hand of Richard Maurice Hunt's sister, Jane Maria Hunt. However, as mentioned, Hunt's mother was also called Jane Maria Leavitt Hunt. So just like we had 2 Janes, we actually had 2 hands, because at the Bennington Museum is another version of the same hand, this time identified at the left hand to the wrist of Jane Maria Leavitt Hunt, mother of Richard Maurice Hunt. Now, I might have found the answer to this problem when I visited the Newport City Town Hall. Searching for Richard Maurice Hunt's will, I also discovered his sister's will, in which I read that she gave to her nephew Jarvis the bronze cast of her mother's hand, which I believe is the hand at the Bennington Museum. So with this new information, we changed our interpretation of the object. We now believe that the hand is Hunt's mother's hand, and the inscription, the signature of the artist, Sister Jane. Now, this new interpretation conveys a more intimate meaning to this object. It's a tribute from her daughter to her mother, who actually had a hand on the education of her children. Even though attribution to Richard Maurice Hunt is certainly not totally out of the question, we do know that Jane was an accomplished artist herself, even though, because she was a woman, she was not granted the same opportunities as her brothers. For example, in the exhibition, on loan from the Bennington Museum, is a splendid mason chocolate set painted by Jane with scenes of the family house in Brattleboro, Vermont. So really, Richard Maurice Hunt, becoming the very first American architect formally trained at the École des Beaux-Arts, marks the contrast, opposing Jane's education to her siblings' education. The École des Beaux-Arts originated from the reign of Louis XIV in France in the 17th century, and such program simply did not exist at that time in America. Even though Hunt failed his first admission, later on, his instructor, the renowned architect Hector Martin de Fuel, certainly saw a lot of potential in him. Newly appointed head of the construction for the unification of the Louvre and Tuileries palaces, Lefebvre hired some of his students, including the young Richard Maurice Hunt, to work as inspectors of construction. The extent of Hunt's contribution to the Louvre remains unknown. He was reportedly in charge of all the studies for the newly built Pavillon de la Bibliothèque, which still stands nowadays. Now, this commission should have been the beginning of a brilliant European career for Hunt. However, the young American architect certainly had another plan. In Paris, I was fortunate to discover new documents related to Hunt's work on the Louvre, including his resignation letter. In this letter, written only a few months after Hunt was hired, he wrote that a bad medical condition forced him to resign from his position. And while this was certainly true, we know from other documents that Hunt's ambition was actually to be at Hughes in his home country. So by the time of his resignation, Hunt surely felt that time had come. A few months after leaving the Louvre, and as he was about to come home, Hunt wrote to his mother. He wrote to his mother. Yes. It has been represented to me that America was not ready for the fine arts, but I think they are mistaken. There is no place in the world where they are more needed or where they should be more encouraged. Richard Morissant was certainly returning to America with more than just the formal training of the École des Beaux-Arts. His former student in New York, the architect Henry Van Brunt, remembered. He brought back from the School of Fine Arts in Paris not merely a collection of venerable formula and academic prejudice to make us still more dependent, but a spirit enlarged, enlightened, cosmopolitan. Now, this was the consequence of the numerous travels Hunt undertook while he lived in Europe. So here we have a map of some of the travels Hunt did between 1843 and 1855, when he first stayed in Europe, two different colors corresponding to two different periods of him traveling. And so as you can see, France, Italy, Switzerland, Germany, England, Belgium, Holland, Egypt, Greece, Turkey, many more. Later on, he also came back multiple times to France, England, Germany, and Italy, also adding to his list Russia, Spain, or even Norway. Now, seeing this map, you could think that Hunt had seen it all. But had he? We have to think that when we talk about the world in this context, it implies a specific acceptation defined by Hunt's training at the École des Beaux-Arts and excluding regions then perceived as exotic, such as most of Africa, South America, Asia, or Oceania. So I understand that Loeffel encouraged Hunt to travel, for example, offering him introduction letters to French chateaux. However, I also realized that another source of inspiration was Hunt's own little brother, Leavitt. So as mentioned earlier, Leavitt Hunt was a pioneer in early photography. With his friend, the American sculptor Nathan Baker, he became, in the winter of 1851, the first American to photograph his travel to Egypt and the Near East. In the exhibition is a wonderful album compiled by Leavitt Hunt of some of the best images resulting from this experience. I learned from Richard Morissant's journal that Leavitt's trip was heavily influential on him. A few weeks after his brother returned, Hunt embarked on a similar journey, living in the summer of 1852 and returning only 1 year later. In Malta, on his way to Alexandria in Egypt, Hunt wrote, "It was hard for me to leave Paris. Nothing could have tempted me to do it but the desire, or rather sense of obligation to do my duty. I was able and ought to travel Europe, Asia Minor, etc. Leavitt, without knowing it, resolved me to do it in the following old manner. After conversing about my studies, etc., etc., he ended in saying, 'You're rotting in Paris.' Enough said." From his travels, Hunt brought back numerous sketches, notes, plaster casts, and objects. He also compiled a collection of thousands of photographs, all of which were introduced to the United States when he returned. Now, the Hunt collection was fundamental for the training of the next generations of American architects. This collection was unique in America, especially considering that most of the public museums and libraries we know today did not exist when Hunt returned home. Exactly. In addition to his role as a founding father of the American Institute of Architects in 1857, Hunt started to welcome students in his New York studio at the 10th Street Studio building. In doing so, he essentially changed the future of America's architecture and the way the discipline was taught. So now please take a moment Have a look at this photograph of the New York studio and listen to the words of his former student, Henry van Brunt. To us, it was a revelation, an enlargement of vision so sudden and complete that the few years spent by us in that stimulating atmosphere were the most memorable and eventful in life. His photographs, books, and prints, his own drawings, gave us a large view over the whole historical field. Hunt's influence on the education of architecture in America was even more concrete, considering that one of his former students, William Robert Ware, later became the first director of the School of Architecture at MIT and then head of the Department of Architecture at Columbia College, the latter to which were referred as a direct outcome of the 10th Street studio. So this passion for traveling and collecting allowed Richard Maurice Hunt to be involved in the birth of renowned public institutions, such as the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Lenox Library in New York City. For these two institutions, he worked not only as an architect, he was also involved in the development of their collections. But most importantly, in this journey, Richard Maurice Hunt was not alone. With his patrons and clients, he formed a network that shaped the early development of public museums and libraries, as well as the collecting practice of the Gilded Age through private collections. For example, Alva and William K. Vanderbilt had in their New York house, commissioned to Richard Maurice Hunt, the very first pieces of furniture in the United States with a French royal provenance. And here in their memoirs, Alva wrote about the construction of Marble House, that after traveling the world, she had now to choose her favorite bloom. Now, this attitude recalls, in some capacity, Hunt's traveling the world to study architecture models and cultures. We also get interesting insights and anecdotes from Catherine Helen Hunt's biography of her husband to help us to understand the kind of relationships Hunt had with these networks of patrons and clients. Now, in that regard, my favorite objects in the show is definitely the portrait of Thomas Gould Appleton. The son of a wealthy Boston merchant, Appleton was a gentleman artist who was also instrumental in founding the Boston Public Library and was a supporter of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, right? This portrait, I believe, alludes to his activity as an art collector and amateur of antique, with a reference to the portraits of European gentlemen on their grand tour during the 18th century. Indeed, Appleton, just like Hunt, traveled extensively, including with the Hunt family in 1845, visiting Greece and Turkey. Then a Newport cottager, when after he commissioned Hunt with a house in the city by the sea, Catherine Helen Hunt honored him with these kinds of words. Tom Appleton used to say that his house grew out of the good things we gave him to it, particularly lobster prepared in some way which tickled his palate. He was immensely original and an intelligent companion, but I sometimes used to wish he wouldn't come at 11 o'clock and stay all day. Another close friend and collaborator, Henry Marquardt, was one of the most important art collectors in the late 19th century New York. The second president of the Metropolitan Museum, Marquardt was just like Hunt, a prominent trustee of the newly born institution. His contribution to the Met collection cannot be overstated and included, for example, the very first Vermeer in America. He also traveled extensively in Europe and gathered an impressive collection of works of art, and he commissioned Hunt with numerous projects, including a New York house and a Newport cottage, Linden Gate, also known as Bric-a-Brac Hall because of his display of artworks. But according to Catherine Helen Hunt, the two friends would also enjoy rail trips together. In February, she wrote, Richard was persuaded to go to Mexico with Monsieur Marquardt on his private car. He was very tired, and the entire change in new interest did him a great deal of good. He only reached out on the eve of the costume ball given as a housewarming by Monsieur and Mrs. Vanderbilt. Now, the ball Catherine Helen Hunt referenced here is arguably one of the most important and prestigious social events of America's Gilded Age. According to Alva's own words, more than 1,600 invitations were sent to celebrate the opening of her brand new New York house, Richard Maurice Hunt's 660 Fifth Avenue, also known as Petit Château, built between 1878 and 1882. So on this slide is Hunt in his costume for the evening, dressed as the 13th century Florentine artist Cimabue. And it's certainly an interesting choice, referencing the history of art, maybe with a sense of introspection. Indeed, Cimabue had been a pioneer of Florentine painting who initiated through his student Giotto the turn to the Renaissance. And that's exactly how people in the Gilded Age understood Giotto, mostly as an instructor. Now, this costume is even more interesting, considering that we know that Catherine Holland Hunt, his wife, actually picked it, getting her inspiration in one of the books of their library. Catherine Holland Hunt understood her husband's contribution to America, but more than just a companion, her own contribution should not be silenced. For example, she is responsible for organizing the Hunt's library after the death of her husband, working with Janet Cook Lewis, another woman that she hired, and whose catalog and conservation work on the Hunt collection actually reveal her as the world's expert book doctor. 660 Fifth Avenue was a turning point in the history of American architecture, and we are very grateful to present in the exhibition rare items related to the iconic Chateauesque mansion, unfortunately demolished in 1927. From the Hayler family are presented, potentially for the first time ever, original panels from the dining room carved by the firm of Elter brother or Léon Marcotte. Coming from the Museum of New York City is also a plaster cast of Richard Maurice Hunt, as a stonemason. Now, this figure was originally in the Newport studio of Richard Maurice Hunt, as seen on this photograph. So just to make it clear, Hunt had two studios, one in New York, one in Newport. This figure is another version of the original sculpture that Hunt's worker put on the roof of the mansion as an homage to the architect. And it seems that Hunt loved this figure so much, his wife chose it to appear on a bookplate when she assembled the print collection of her husband. On this slide, yes. Unfortunately, this image did not make it to the show, is an amazing photograph that I found in newspapers, showing the original sculpture being taken down before the demolition of the mansion. One of the workmen is actually taking his hat off as the figure is about to touch the ground. A gesture of homage that reminds me of this tribute signed by the workers at Biltmore in 1895, just after Hunt died. Hunt died during the construction, showing us what a respected man and artist Hunt was, as he helped elevating not only architecture, but craftsmanship in America. And just to make it clear, or as a reminder, George Washington Vanderbilt commissioned Biltmore in Asheville, North Carolina. It's one of America's largest property and one of Richard Maurice Hunt's most famous commissions. Now, overall, 660 Fifth Avenue and Biltmore are just a small sample of what Richard Maurice Hunt's test accomplished for this country. In Newport, as mentioned in my introduction, Hunt shaped the landscape of the city, from the Griswold House in the early 60s, to the Travers Block in the 70s, and to the Breakers just before his death. But many questions are still waiting to be answered. Let's think about our own collection. The architect of Marble House, a friend of Alva and William K. Vanderbilt, but also an acquaintance of Émile Gavet, was Richard Maurice Hunt, the cultural intermediary who introduced the couple to the famous Parisian art collector, transforming an overbuilt Louis XVI style library into the Gothic room we all know today. Archival material revealed that Hunt purchased boiserie in Paris in 1893. To what extent was he involved in the creation of the ladies' reception room at the Breakers, one of America's earliest period room by Jules Allard? Now please stay with us, as my colleague Laura Bergemann will share the results of our study in a few moments. Finally, Richard Maurice Hunt was a trustee of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and his efforts to help the museum should not be forgotten, especially his contribution to form the collection of plaster casts, including a donation of more than 540 plasters in 1880. This donation including one of William Maurice Hunt's design, the Flight of Night, used for a ceiling in the New York State Capitol in Albany. Now, I cannot think of a better object to end this presentation, and I'd like to thank our curator of collections, Nikki Williams, for helping me formalizing my thoughts. On the first hand, I love to think of the Flight of Night as the illustration of the Hunts as a collaborative artistic family. This scene was first designed by Richard's brother, William Morris Hunt, in Paris in 1848, but based on a poem William received from his other brother, Levitt. Now, many years later, Richard Morris Hunt gave a plaster to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In addition, let's all think about this. The three horses of the Persian goddess of the night, Anahita, represent darkness and accompanied by a torchbearer. They are fleeing, leaving space for a new light to arrive. It's a representation of transition, essentially. In the same way, we can think of Richard Morris Hunt as the transitional figure, ushering in a new light, a new age of American architecture. And I should say, a transitional figure, not the transitional figure. I'm just skipping some questions for the rest. This exhibition would also not have been possible without the tremendous efforts of the many institutions responsible for the conservation and study of Richard Morris Hunt's materials. In particular, the Library of Congress, home of the Hunt collection, a repository of more than 15,000 documents collected and assembled by Richard Morris Hunt, his wife, and their two oldest sons. The LLC is also in the process of an extensive campaign of digitization to make this material available for everyone. We're also grateful to the Vermont Historical Society and Bennington Museum in Vermont, which also preserve a large amount of materials related to the Hunt family, as well as our local partners, the Newport Hunt Museum and Newport Historical Society and all the other lenders. Now, on a personal level, I'd like to thank, here we go, our CEO, Trudy Cox, Chairman Peter Harris, as well as the supporters of tonight's lecture, Jacalyn and William Egan. And of course, our amazing staff at PSNC and the Preservation Society, I should say, who supported and made this exhibition possible, in particular our chief curator, Leslie Jones, and Dr. Catherine Moran. And thank you to all of the supporters of our fellowship program. So please, don't forget to visit the exhibition upstairs after the end of our program. But for now, please help me give a round of applause to our next speaker, Laura Bergemann.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Laura Bergemann, and I am a conservation research intern, or fellow, I'm a fellow, here at the Preservation Society of Newport County. And tonight, I'll be discussing my year-long fellowship in investigating Allard interiors. When many people visit Newport and explore our properties, they're often first struck by the architectural grandeur of our houses, which are architected or designed by numerous luminaries like Richard Morris Hunt, Horace Trumbauer, and the firm of McKim, Mead & White. But while these buildings vary in their exteriors, they're united by their equally splendid interiors, which in many cases were designed by just one firm, Jules Allard and Sons. Jules Allard was one of the most sought-after interior designers of the Gilded Age, and when his company closed in 1907 after more than 30 years of business in the United States, he had furnished the homes of over 300 elite clients, including the Astors and the Vanderbilts, and he was well regarded in New York society as the man who made the Gilded Age glitter. For us at the Preservation Society, he's of particular importance, as 4 of our houses, including the house and room that we're currently in today, include interiors that were at least partially or fully furnished by Allard. And to that end, prior research conducted by our curator emeritus, Paul Miller, our former chief conservator, Jeff Moore, and fellows including Ben Bowery and Théo Lourenço have focused on Jules Allard furniture, his workshop practice, and the other interiors that he's provided for our houses. But over the course of my fellowship, we've shifted our focus from the furniture themselves to the interiors, and in particular to the wall paneling or boiserie that defines these spaces. Over the past year, I've conducted an investigation into 4 rooms in particular, namely the ladies' reception room and the breakfast room at the Breakers, and the drawing room and the ballroom at the Elms. While for tonight's presentation, I'll only be discussing 2 of these rooms in detail, it's important to note that all 4 provided valuable insight into Allard's methods, materials, and practice. This investigation is part of a larger conservation initiative that aims to build a comprehensive history of the wall paneling within these rooms using the physical material themselves. And as part of that, we're interested in 3 key aspects. The first is construction. What are these panels made of, and how were they made? The second, condition. How have these wall panels changed over time, both intentionally and unintentionally? And third, confirmation, scientifically validating things we believed or suspected, but didn't yet have the physical evidence to prove. This is part of our ongoing mission here at the Preservation Society to continue to preserve these spaces, ensure that they are in proper environments, and provide interventive conservation when needed. Over the course of my research, I used a combination of archival research and in situ examination, and to that end, I examined many documents that help us understand how these rooms could have been designed and assembled. But also, I spent the majority of my time within these rooms themselves, conducting a material survey, a condition assessment, and a technical examination of the kinds of finishes we find in these rooms, most notably paints and gilding. To this end, my most valuable tool in this study was my 20-foot scaffolding, as you can see here, which allows me to roll between different areas of the wall and examine the entire space from the baseboard to the ceiling. There's 2 other specific scientific tools that we use for this kind of study, the first of which is called UV or ultraviolet illumination, which is a specific type of light. When we're looking with things with UV illumination, that allows us to see different types of materials or finishes that may be on the wall. For example, here we're looking at a selection of a panel from the Elms ballroom, which under visible light, like in this room, appears uniformly white to the eye. But once we turn on our ultraviolet illumination, a different profile appears. We can see areas that fluoresce a sort of light blue color and areas that don't fluoresce very much at all. And this suggests to us that this particular panel has been painted at different times with different materials. First, when we're looking at our fluorescent blue area, we correlate that to a 19th century oil-based type of paint. And when we're looking at the areas that don't fluoresce as much in that sort of muddy brown color, we're looking at a 20th century modern emulsion paint, like a latex. So here, the UV allows us to distinguish between what's old and what's older on the wall. Another key tool in this investigation was the analysis of cross-section samples, which involves taking a small bit of material from the wall and looking at that under a microscope. What this allows us to do is not simply investigate what's currently on the wall. We actually take our sample and we flip it on its side, and that allows us to map all of the previous finishes that have been applied to the wall throughout its history. When we do that, we can start to build an idea of all of the interventions that have been applied over time. And also with cross-sections, we also use UV to help distinguish between and highlight different materials that we see. So with these tools in mind, we'll move into our first space of tonight's presentation, which is the ladies' reception room at the Breakers. It's one of the first spaces you encounter as you enter the house, and it's meant to be a sort of informal gathering space for female guests who are invited to the Vanderbilt's large summer soirees that define their season. And it's paired with a gentleman's reception room across the hall. But this room is particularly compelling for us because it's meant to evoke an 18th century Louis XV style salon rendered in creams and golds. And more than just simply evoking the style of Louis XV, this room was believed to actually incorporate 18th century historic elements, making it one of America's first period rooms. Prior research into this room suggested that many of the panels were sourced from the Hôtel Maigret de Sailly, which is a house that still stands in Paris today, but was built in 1778 and does not contain any of its historic interiors. However, we're quite fortunate to have some designs for a salon created by the woodcarver Jules Allard, which are held at the National Library in France. When we compare some of the drawings that we have from Cauvet to the panels that are currently installed in the ladies' reception room, you can see some true similarities between the two. But through the technical examination that I've conducted, we've been able to confirm that these panels aren't just similar, they are in fact the same panels. But we had larger questions when it came to the ladies' reception room. We're not just interested in what comes to us from the 18th century Parisian aristocratic residences, but we're also interested in what Allard did to outfit and furnish this space. So we're interested in not only finding out the pieces that are approaching their 250th birthday in just a few years, but also those that are already past their 125th birthday, and thus were manufactured by Allard. As part of this investigation, the first thing that we will do is look at the construction of different panels. And here you have two exemplar panels, one from the north wall, which is on the left side of the screen, which contains that clock, and one on the west wall, I'm getting my directions wrong, which is on the left side of the screen that does not have a clock motif. We'll look at the north wall panel first. I'll draw your attention to the parallel striations that run along the entire length of the panel, as denoted here. These suggest to us that this panel was constructed in the 18th century because what we're seeing here are joined wood boards that abut one another and are glued together to create one smooth surface across which the decoration can be applied. It's important to note that when this room was originally installed in 1895, these striations would not have been as apparent as they are today in the room. In contrast, when we look at the west wall panels, we see no striations, and in fact, it's very characteristically smooth. This suggests to us that this panel was manufactured by Allard in the 19th century, and it still has those wood boards that are joined together. They're just hidden underneath sheets of veneer that create a sort of proto-plywood and give us that very, very smooth exterior surface. And it's by comparing and contrasting these different types of techniques across the room that we can trace what's been reused in this room from the 18th century and what was manufactured anew in the 19th century. We're also interested in the finishes that were applied to the wall, and the major tool that we use here again is the cross-section sampling. I'm showing you here a sample location, this cross-section in my hand so you can see the approximate size, and also the cross-section under the microscope, which, as you can see, is mostly all creams and whites. But when we look under the microscope, we can clearly see that there are two different paint applications under this magnification. The first is the lower layer, which I've labeled as number 1, which is our original Allard finish applied in 1895. And over top is our second layer, which was applied in the mid-20th century and constitutes sort of modern emulsion paint. We can see this even more clearly when we look under UV, and we see that our lower Allard applied finish fluoresces, which we expect with the 19th century oil-based paint. But our upper layer, again, number 2, is our more modern 20th century paint, which does not fluoresce at all. But it's important to remember when we're looking at cross-sections that they only offer us a small window into what's going on at that particular space where we took the sample. And so to understand what's going on in the room at large, we need to take our UV into the space itself. Here I'm showing you two different panels, the Minerva panel and the Astrolabe panel, which are on the east and the west walls respectively, and they face each other across the room. Looking at these panels, they don't appear to differ in any way, and that's true in the room too. They appear to be the same color. But when we turn the lights off and we use our ultraviolet illumination, a different profile appears for the two of them. For both, all the areas that were gilded in the previous image do not fluoresce, and that's what we expect to see with a true gold leaf finish. But when we're comparing the two, the Minerva panel, all of its painted surfaces do fluoresce, and in the room it's a very clear sort of cream green color. This suggests to us that what we're looking at is the Allard applied finish from 1895, which has not been touched in over 120 years. In contrast, when we're looking at the Astrolabe panel, there's very little fluorescence, and in fact, the entire painted surface is essentially black. What we see here is, in contrast, the Astrolabe panel has been painted, probably in the mid-20th century, with that non-fluorescent, modern emulsion-based paint. We can trace this around the room and understand what's gone on in this space, where there's actually been a selective overpaint campaign that was done in this room at some point in the mid-20th century, probably in response to a water event. The result means that the north and the west walls were overpainted and therefore do not fluoresce, and the east and the south walls were not touched at all, and indeed haven't been touched in their entire history, and therefore retain their Allard finish for us to enjoy in the space. But we're also interested in changes that have occurred unintentionally over time. As part of the exhibition for Richard Morris Hunt in a New Light, which is upstairs, we deinstalled the sconces in the ladies' reception room to be reinstalled here as part of the exhibition space. In doing so, we revealed hidden paint that had been underneath that sconce for, again, the entire history of the room since 1895. When we compare the hidden paint with the rest of the paint that's been exposed on the panel, we see a difference in color, where the exposed paint takes on this creamy, almost greenish tone, and the hidden paint underneath is a very peach pink color. This offers us a rare glimpse into understanding the original color of this room and what it may have looked like when first installed. And it also indicates to us how light exposure has subtly altered the room's condition and presentation over time. The final prong for the investigation into the ladies' reception room was confirming which parts of the room actually come from the Hôtel de Sailly. Here in this diagram, they're marked out in red, and they correspond to the 18th century. And around the room, that constitutes approximately 30% of the paneling we see. As we expected, there are a lot of panels in this room that were manufactured by Allard, and they're marked out here in blue, denoting the 19th century. And around this room, this also constitutes approximately 60% of the panels in this room. But the last 10% of the panels, which are here marked in purple, were a mystery and a curiosity to us, because they seem to be hybrid panels that contain materials from both the 18th and the 19th centuries. Here we're looking at one of those panels in particular, which is an overdoor within the room. When we look at it closely, we can see that it consists of that very smooth proto-plywood that we attribute to Allard. But unlike every other panel in the room, this gilded and carved decoration has been nailed in, which stands in contrast to the rest of the panels, which have their decoration glued or carved into the board. We can also see when we take a cross-section that what we're looking at is two gilding layers, one that sits beneath the current gilding that we see within the room, which was applied in 1895. This suggests to us that Allard took this material, which had been previously gilded in the 18th century, stripped it, and re-gilded it for use in the breakers. This is something we weren't expecting to see, as it truly combines the 18th and the 19th centuries together in unexpected ways. With that in mind, we move into another room and another building entirely, namely the drawing room at the Elms. We came into this space with the assumption that Allard had constructed everything in this room anew for the Bergemanns when this house was constructed in 1901. But with our findings from the breakers under our belt, we wanted to ensure that we weren't missing any older material hiding in plain sight. This was also spurred on by the greater context of the Elms, which is itself very deeply connected to 18th century French architecture. The architect for the Elms, Horst Trumbauer, deeply borrowed from the front facade of the Château d'Asnières, which is a chateau in the environs of Paris that still stands today, and you can define for yourself how closely you think they resemble one another. And more than just borrowing from the design, we know that actual materials from the Château d'Asnières made their way over to Newport, and the most prominent example of that are the statues of Apollo and Aphrodite, which once were found outside the Château d'Asnières and then also outside of the Elms, and now reside inside of the Elms Conservatory. So when we embarked upon our investigation of the drawing room's construction and contents, we wanted to be quite careful in our investigation to make sure that we didn't miss any incorporation of this architectural salvage, which would have been older than the house itself, which may be hiding in these walls. There's one additional curiosity that remains about the drawing room, as a historic photograph from 1901 reveals an intriguing detail. The central panels of the north and south walls once contained a barometer and a clock, respectively, which faced each other across the room, and they were ornately, sculpturally carved. However, these features are now gone, and they're replaced with plain panels, which were used by the Bergemanns to hang and display their extensive art collection. When and why this change occurred became a key research question, with an eye towards building that comprehensive history of the room that we are interested in. To answer these questions, we needed to examine unaltered panels first, in both their construction and their condition. To start our investigation in this room, we used an endoscope, which may also be familiar to you as a plumber's camera, to peer behind the panels. It's not possible for us, in almost all cases, to remove panels from the wall without doing a significant amount of damage. As in most Allard constructed rooms, the allowances of panels range between an 1/8 to a 1/16 to a 32nd of an inch, ensuring that we wouldn't be able to get inside without pulling things apart. So where we can, we need to use different tools, like an endoscope, to get a view behind. So in this case, we managed to sneak a camera in between the wood of the panel, which is at the lowest part of this image, and the masonry of the wall, which is at the top. This offers us also a glimpse into the impressive precision with which these panels were assembled in Paris, shipped to New York, and then installed here in Newport with near invisible seams. What we're looking at here is the frame of the wood panel, which frames around an inset panel, which is itself screwed into the wall. This panel that I'm highlighting is the panel that would have had to be replaced and removed as part of this panel swap. As with the breakers, we're also interested in understanding how conditions have changed over time. And in this image, we can actually see evidence that there's been a repainting campaign in this room as well. And as is typical when we see repainting in our rooms, it's actually darker than the original finish. We can also use our ultraviolet light and reveal that once again, we're going from a 19th century oil-based finish to a 20th century modern emulsion paint. And we're very lucky to actually know exactly when this happened, as we have evidence from the Newport Gazette, which shows us house staff painting in this room in 1970, shortly after the house was acquired by the Preservation Society. But we're also very fortunate that the painters skipped over some key transitional spaces, namely the vestibules that connect the drawing room and the ballroom. When we're looking at these walls in visible light, it's difficult to tell what's going on. But once again, under ultraviolet illumination, we see that these spaces fluoresce a yellow-green color, which we didn't see in the previous image. When we compare this vestibule with cross-section samples taken from other areas of the room, which have been overpainted, we can see a clear difference. Here in the cross-section, we see that there has been the Allard finish, labeled number 1, which fluoresces that yellow-green we see in the vestibule space. But in other areas of the room, it's been overpainted on 2 occasions with a blue fluorescent material and then with our third paint, our non-fluorescent emulsion paint, which we know was applied in the 1970s. So we're very grateful again that in the vestibules, we can see an Allard finish untouched from 1901. And this brings us to another part of our investigation, confirming the potential reuse of decoration within this room. Within the drawing room, the only real decoration are the 4 overdoors, which constitute each one of the different seasons. And here we're looking at the summer panel. I'm giving you a comparison with a period room in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is genuine 18th century material. And hopefully you can see some stylistic similarities that the artists have chosen, including drawing or carving wheat stalks and different farming tools. But more than just stylistic similarities, we see evidence on our summer and all seasonal panels that they too are reused from the 18th century. Even though they constitute that Allard proto-plywood smooth board we attribute to the 19th century, once again, all the decoration here has been nailed on, similar to what we saw in the ladies' reception room. And in this case, we weren't able to confirm reuse with our cross-section analysis, but we are quite confident that here, once again, we're looking at reuse and recombination between the 18th and the 19th centuries. And now we'll return to our question about what happened in the drawing room with those central panels. To answer this question, we are going to compare different cross-sections, those from the areas of the room that are unaltered, and samples from our panel which we know was replaced. When we do so, we can see, as expected, our unaltered panels do contain the 3 separate paints. In contrast, however, our replacement panels only have 2 layers and pick up with our second layer with a blue fluorescence. This would be suggestive to us that when our new panels were installed, that spurred on the first campaign of overpainting we see in this space. We can actually be even more specific than that and start to date our cross-sections, As we know, our first layer had to be applied in 1901 to finish out this space. And thanks to some recent archival evidence, we know that our second layer, attributed to the panel swap, had to be completed sometime around 1912, which is when the Bergmanns purchased 2 new paintings that we know hung in this space and hung on those replacement panels. And thanks to the Newport Gazette, we know that our final layer had to be applied in 1970. So now we have a very comprehensive understanding and history of the finishes in this room. I'd just like to speak a little bit more about how astonishing this replacement is, because we see very little structural disruption in this space. To replace this panel would have been an incredibly involved process, and it probably would have involved disassembling almost essentially totally every panel that we see on this wall. And what's more astonishing is that we see very few evidence or very little evidence of changes. I'm highlighting for you here a piece of the boiserie where the horizontal crosspiece meets the top of the vertical panel. I'm highlighting this for you because this is the only piece of woodwork in this entire room that is not flush with the other piece of woodwork. And this suggests to us that this is the piece that was removed and then replaced as part of the panel swap. That such a delicate and involved operation was pulled off with virtually no sign is really a testament to the extraordinary craftsmanship at play in this space and in all Allard constructed spaces. We can also map the materials in this room to understand their correspondence to different timelines, and the results do correspond in some ways to those we saw at the Breakers. Here again, we have multiple blue panels, which we attribute to Allard's workshop, constructed in the 19th century, but we do have those 20th century green panels in the center, which constitute those panels that were replaced. Here again, we also have the purple hybrid panels, which contain both 18th and 19th century materials, something we weren't expecting to see in any space, although they suggest very thoughtful reuse by Allard. As for the impact of my research, my findings are already guiding real conservation work. As in the ladies' reception room, members of our conservation team have already begun to stabilize loose elements and begun cleaning tests as well for some of the finishes. And at the Elms, our next steps include a deeper scientific study of the paint materials we found, work that's already begun with the Nanosciences and Nanotechnology Department at the University of Rhode Island, where we're interested not only in when and how these paints were applied, but their deeper chemical compositions. Finally, although I've spoken quite a bit tonight about Allard as a singular designer, it's clear that these extraordinary rooms were the product of many hands. And through our archival work, we've uncovered the names of numerous diverse artisans who worked with Allard and Sons in their New York and Paris workshops. And although you won't be able to read any or all of these names on this slide, the craftsmanship of these individuals remains visible in every interior I've spoken about tonight. And just as Allard had many contributors to his great projects, so did I. I'm deeply grateful to everyone who helped support this research over the past year, and I thank them for their support, in particular Trudy Cox, our CEO, Peter Harris, our chairman, and Jacalyn and William Egan, who made this night possible. And I thank you all here tonight and on Zoom for your attention this evening. Thank you very much.
We'll be happy to take any questions from the audience if you'd like to raise your hand. Oh, Mike Franco.
That was wonderful. Thank you. You both discussed 2 very unusual characters, Hunt and Allard, but you looked at them as separate characters. I was hoping you could discuss the relationship between the 2, both in terms of any personal, social connection and their collaborative efforts.
Sure. So I will let maybe Théo speak a little bit more, but we have archival evidence that helps us understand better the relationship between Allard and other architects, and also Richard Morris Hunt and other interior designers. But it's clear that Richard Morris Hunt and Allard had a kinship with one another. Their communications, although we don't have many, suggest that they liked working with one another, even on the incredibly tight deadlines that they were under. I also think they felt a certain kinship. They were similar age. I think Richard Morris Hunt also thought of himself as very French, and Allard obviously is very French. So they clearly liked one another, and they also like to, let's say, complain to each other about the other people that they were working with, who will remain unnamed. But it's clear that they enjoyed the work that they did, and a testament to that is that they worked together on more than just the projects at the Breakers and at Marble House. They had multiple collaborations in New York as well.
I guess personally, I wish we knew more. There are many questions that are still remained unanswered. The first one being, how did the first connection was established, right? I think, as you mentioned it, Hunt had very important connections in France, and Allard obviously was very well established in France before he came to the US in the early, mid-1880s for the establishment of his New York branch. But obviously, we can get lost between all these connections, right? There is like overlaps, I should say, maybe in the people they knew and the people they potentially worked with in France or in America. Obviously, Allard, I believe his first project in America, we believe, is for William Henry Vanderbilt, right? That's an interesting connection, but does not explain a lot of things when you think about it. If it's his first commission in the US and it's for Vanderbilt, that's quite interesting. And the other thing that I'd like to mention maybe is we understand Hunt as a coordinator in his work, as an architect, because that's how he was trained in Paris, right? That's the tradition of the École des Beaux-Arts, this idea of the unity of art, unité de l'art in French. Essentially, if I'm an architect, I also need to think about the other components of the building. So we know that Hunt was providing designs for rooms, but also sometimes for details, sometimes for pieces of furniture. And once again, I would say there are overlaps with what Allard was doing. We also know that Hunt was touring with some clients to get historical material from Europe. Allard, as an art dealer, was able to do the same thing. So I think there is still a lot to learn about their connection and how they worked together as individuals, but everything you said was valid. Obviously, they were huge collaborators and worked on numerous projects together. So clearly, they had fun, I guess.
Great presentation, guys. My question is for Théo. What find in your research was most surprising for you?
First of all, to the both of you, thank you for your questions. I guess I'm really, really surprised, and that's something that I will keep with me forever, by Hunt's ability to have a vision. And from quite an early age, if we trust the documentation that we have, and I don't think we have any reason to distrust it, he understood from his time in Europe that there was something that he could do in this country. And I do respect this vision. I always remember, I think Paul Baker is writing this very important book about Richard Morris Hunt, and he's mentioning one of his friend from childhood. My pronunciation, sorry, is going to be wrong. Theodore Winthrop, the author and all that. Thank you very much. Writing apparently to his mom, saying that Hunt is working very hard and very fast because he wants to come home early and be at use in America. That's something that really I do respect and I appreciate a lot about Hunt, is that he had this clear vision about what was possible in this country. He had a vision. I also personally think that he had a good sense of business, because he probably understood that he had this very specific profile, being the first American educated in Paris. When he comes back to the US, he would be able to have a lot of commissions. But yeah, I think this vision is something that I really, really enjoyed. Sorry, it's too long every time. Sorry, someone needs to
Sorry, we're over here.
Laura, can you share with us, we've been hearing your wonderful remarks about Allard and sons. Mm-hmm. What happened to the sons and happened to Allard at Fee?
Right, so wonderful question, thank you. So Allard had 4 children, one of whom unfortunately passed away in infancy. He had a daughter, Lucie, and then 2 sons, Fernand and Georges. We know a limited amount of information, but what we know is interesting. When Allard and Sons actually opened in the United States, it was not opened by Jules Allard, it was opened by his sons, Fernand and Georges. So we can think of the Paris branch as being Jules Allard, and maybe the New York branch as being and Sons. Although we know that many clients had deep communication with all three members of the family in particular. We imagine that Georges was probably the brains of the operation. He was potentially sent to London for a period of time to oversee the operations that they were undertaking there, which we know very little about. We think that he was probably the most administrative-minded, and he is the person who closed the business in the Paris branch after his father passed away. Fernand is a very interesting character to us as well. We know that he came to New York essentially every year for 6 to 8 months at a time, arriving in the fall and leaving in the spring to enjoy Paris in the summertime, which we can all appreciate. But Fernand, we know, was in a very client-facing position. He is written about extensively in the one most valuable document that we have, which explains that Fernand visits different projects, he talks to clients, and he talks to draftsmen, suggesting that he not only knows how to communicate with these very demanding clients, but he also is a designer in his own right, which we also believe Georges was as well. We know very, very little about Lucie, his daughter, and that's another topic that I'm very interested in pursuing. I know we've talked about Jules Allard and Sons, but I think the family is much larger than any of us really know.
I had a question about restoration and conservation. Is there any intention to go back to the oil-based paints rather than these acrylics in future restoration?
So we're actively formulating the ways that we'd like to pursue conservation in these spaces, as my investigation was really the first foray into understanding these rooms cumulatively. I will say the conservation work that's being undertaken in the ladies' reception room right now actually focuses on cleaning finishes, but not necessarily taking them back to how they originally looked in 1895. And in some senses, when we're seeing the accumulation of light degradation, which has changed the room from that pink color to that more cream color, there's really no way that we can accurately take that all the way back without repainting the entire room again. It's something that we can obviously consider as we move forward with our conservation. Unfortunately, I will not be here. So my work really ends here, and it's meant to help guide the future conservation decisions that will be made within this space and within all the spaces that Allard has touched. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have collaborated with such a wonderful conservation team, which really has so much expertise and will, of course, make the best decision for this room.
Thank you very much for that very interesting thing. It's interesting that Richard Morris Hunt also had sons, but was never incorporated into the name of the firm. I'm wondering what you discovered about his studios in terms of how they operated, because the number of projects he was working on simultaneously is extraordinary, even by modern standards, and one wonders how big his studio was in New York, how big his studio was in Newport, and how he managed to operate those in a time before email and smartphones.
Thank you for your question. Obviously, very, very interesting questions that I'm still trying to investigate. As for numbers, I won't be able to give a specific number, but here's what I know. 2 studios. We know that Hunt, obviously, using letters, telegraphs, and it was working just fine. We also know that with Allard. So I guess communication would work even though they didn't use iPhones. As for the rest, he had many assistants, as you may think. We know that from time to time he would send some of his assistants to Newport, for example, to be in charge and work on some drawings. Actually, in the show, we have an elevation from Marble House, showing a note of one of his assistants called Anthony, saying that, for example, Mrs. Vanderbilt decided that whatever she decided, I can't really remember. But so yes, he was relying on these I would say, students' assistants to work with him. We do not names because of these signatures that we find sometimes on drawings. And I would even say that sometimes Hunt was also traveling in Europe, as I said. I believe he was in Europe for part of the construction of the Lennox Library, for example. And once again, we have evidence that he was, well, still trying to communicate with his clients, and apparently was very sorry that he wasn't there. But once again, he was relying on these people in the studio to work with him, essentially.
Can I add one quick thing onto that, too? We do know that by 1894, his son, Richard Howland Hunt, is on the signature of his letterhead. So it's the architecture firm of Richard Morris Hunt, but it lists his son as basically his partner.
Yes, thank you, Leslie. I completely forgot the first part of your question. I'm so sorry. Yes, indeed. Richard Howland Hunt was educated at the École des Beaux-Arts in France, just like his dad. I believe MIT, too, and actually collaborated with his brother, too. And eventually when his brother died, the Hunt and Hunt closed, and essentially that's when the Hunt collection went to the AIA, now LSE. And now to the LSE.
Any more questions? Well, I just want to close by saying, again, thank you for all of the dedicated work you've done for us this year. I am immensely proud, as the Director of Museum Affairs, to work with these incredible scholars. We hope that you join us next Tuesday when we have the Kiernan Lecture featuring Priscilla and Isabella. And thank you for your support and hopefully your continued support as we take on large projects that mean so much not only to us as the caretakers of these properties, but also to the Newport community. So thank you, and we look forward to seeing you next Tuesday.